Well, good morning. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for inviting me, Harvey. I want to do three things this morning. I want to tell you a little bit about behavioral economics. I want to talk about what it is and what behavioral economists do and what they don't do. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the implications of all of that wonderful stuff for financial well-being and financial literacy. And then I want to make a case as to why financial literacy is not enough, why we actually need to augment that with some of these ideas that I'll talk about this morning. But my goal here is that at the end of the session, hopefully everybody has one or two specific ideas that they can take back with them. And in case anybody would like more information or have questions after today, you can always send me a tweet at Dilip Soman. That's always the quickest way of getting a hold of me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions well after today's session. So, having said all of that, let me begin, and I want to start off by sort of talking about the behavioral economist as compared to the economist. Right now, economics is a wonderful discipline. It's a discipline that sort of, at its very roots, has human behavior on which it bases its foundations. It is a discipline that studies economic behavior in very, very specific contexts, but it makes a number of strong assumptions about human beings. And the strongest assumptions it makes about human beings is that human beings are rational. Right? And rationality is sort of a fairly complex, a complex issue. There are many definitions for it. I don't want to kind of get into those. But let's think about a simple problem, right? How much should I save for my retirement? Right? So suppose somebody came to you and said, well, you know, how much should I save for retirement? How should the economic agent go about answering that question? Well, it turns out in economics, there's a very precise theory that answers that question. That theory is called the life cycle hypothesis of consumption. It basically says that every human, every agent consumes and earns such that the net present value of their future consumption stream equals to the net present value of their income stream. It's a very elegant model. You can write it out in one equation, lots of lemmas and gammas and sigmas in there. But if I try and translate that into prescriptive advice for an individual, well, what does that mean? It means the individual needs to predict how long they'll live. They need to predict what their income stream is going to be. They need to predict the state of the world. They need to predict how many kids they'll have, what the kids will do, will they support them in life or not, how much they're going to need to spend on education. All of that stuff, they're going to need to know when they're going to die, and then they will need to set aside, after taking the appropriate discount rate, the appropriate amount of savings for retirement. Right now, I don't think any human being can do that. I don't know about you. Right? But I think human beings have trouble adding and subtracting and comparing. So, taking discount rates and summing over a lifetime and making predictions kind of seems like it's hard to do. And in fact, this idea was captured beautifully in a recent book by Dick Thaler, who's an economist at the University of Chicago, and Cass Sunstein, who's a law professor at Harvard. They wrote a book called Nudge, and I'll talk about that book in a minute. And in that book, they talked about sort of the idea that there are two kinds of people there are two kinds of entities in the world. There are the so-called econs. Econs are people that inhabit the pages of economics textbooks. These are the people that can predict the future and can, do complex calculations infinitely well. And then there are human beings. Right? And human beings are people like you and me. We sort of sometimes get angry and we get frustrated and we fall in love and we sometimes do things just because. And economists have no way of capturing that sort of just because behavior. They just they don't know how to handle it. Right? And so if you talk to an economist, the average economist will say, well, you know what? Emotions are a nuisance. Right? I wish people were unemotional. And in fact, I was at a conference where somebody remarked that economics is a science which studies. I don't know if you followed, the Star Trek TV show when it was on TV. It's a science that studies Mr. Spock, right? Or people like Mr. Spock, right? They're unemotional, they're rational, they're world-wise, that sort of stuff. People don't do that, and so a group of people in the late 1990s got together and said, you know what, we need a science that actually captures the fact that an economy is made up of human beings and not of econs, right? And the problem with econs is, as time passes by, these econs, these fictitious creatures that inhabit economics textbooks, are getting smarter and smarter. And the reason they're getting smarter is an econ is as smart as the person who writes about the econ, right? So, for example, let's say I write a textbook in which I assume that people are forward-looking, they can anticipate what's going to happen next year, and they make their lifetime consumption decisions based on that anticipation. But that's a smart econ, right? And then my colleague Nina writes another paper this year which says that people aren't just able to anticipate what happens next year, they also know what's going to happen to the economy next year, right? The econ has become smarter, right? And then, that iteration continues. And if you look at a standard economics textbook today, they've portrayed economic agents as super smart people who can compute at the speed of light, and we know that people don't do that, right? So what do people do instead? Well, people we know are supremely inconsistent, right? And I want to spend a little bit of time kind of highlighting some simple principles from human behavior. And I'll talk a little bit about how we can model them. This, by the way, is a true picture. When I first saw this, I thought it was a doctored image. But I chanced upon this particular fitness center near San Diego a couple years back, so I stopped and took this picture. It does exist. It was curious, though, that lots of people took the escalator up to the fitness center. Nobody was taking it down. I actually spent some time observing them. But let me start off by talking about something that I love, and I think all of us love a lot of, coffee. Right? And I'm going to talk about some research that was done a number of years back by a marketing professor at Stanford. His name is Itamar Simonson. And he was trying to understand a very, very simple, quirky human behavior, which is something that he called the compromise effect. And what it basically means is the following, is if you go to a coffee shop and you see 3 sizes of coffee, a small, which is 10 ounces, and a medium, which is 12, and a large, which is 14, most people pick the medium, right? He's a professor. He found this pretty interesting, so he studied the phenomena. And I did too. I found it kind of curious that people pick the medium. I did some research in Hong Kong with a coffee shop. I stopped people that were leaving the coffee shop. This was a coffee shop in a office building, so it had the sort of a fairly standard set of clients. And I asked people, why did you pick the size that you picked? I found that about 70% people picked the medium size. And the response was fairly standard, right? Everybody said, well, the small cup has too little, the large one has too much, I'm going to feel too full, the medium cup has just the right amount of coffee, right? And so we said, well, that's great. After 3 weeks, we did something slightly devious, which is we added 2 ounces of coffee to every size. So instead of 8, 10, and 12, we now made it 10, 12, and 14. Surprise, surprise, people still picked the medium, right? And we asked them why they had picked the medium, same people, and they said, well, didn't I just tell you like 2 weeks back? It's got the right amount of coffee, not too little, not too much. And we tried different things. We took away 2 ounces and we got the same effect. People always pick the one in the middle. Well, not always, most of them pick the one in the middle. And there's a very simple story that explains this, right? And the story is that the environment around you, the choice context, gives you some information about yourself. It's not clear that people have very strong preferences in terms of how much coffee they want. If I asked you, how much coffee do you think you'll drink today? Most people get it wrong, right? Most people don't know how much coffee they need. But there's information in the context. If I see this array, I'm going to tell myself, you know what, I'm not the extreme kind of person. I'm the average person. I'll pick the one in the middle. Right? And it turns out that this works not just for coffee, it works for all kinds of things. So I actually was the victim of this compromise effect about 2.5 years ago. I was driving back from work. I stopped at my favorite gas station on Eglinton and Avenue. This was Petro-Canada. And I was an autopilot. I stuck the nozzle in my gas tank. I was filling up petrol in my car, and then suddenly I stopped and noticed something interesting, right? Which was I had been buying gas from this gas station for years and years and years, and they sold me 87 and 89 and 91, and all of a sudden, that particular day, I saw an octane 94 fuel. I'd never seen that before, right? And it struck me as strange. I'm an engineer by training. I seem to recall from my engineering days, one of the things I had done in engineering school was to study the design of petrol vehicles. And I remembered vaguely that most cars that are made need up to a 90 or 91 octane fuel. You don't really need a 94 octane fuel. So I said, why are they selling 94 octane at a gas station when in fact cars don't need that quality of fuel? So called up a friend of mine in the engineering school. He confirmed that the only engines that need 94 octane fuel are airplane engines. And so I wondered why Petro-Canada was selling 94 octane. I had a former student that worked in Petro-Canada, so I gave him a call and I said, can you share some data on what's actually happening to people's purchasing? And the data said something very interesting, right? The data actually said that before 94 was introduced, octane 89 was the most popular choice, right? After 94 was introduced, you see what I've done there, that blue light? Without thinking, I had picked 91. Right? And I thought I studied human behavior and I understood and monitored behavior, but I fell into that trap. Right? And again, the story is very simple. The story is that now all of a sudden 91 becomes one of the compromise options. It's not the extreme option anymore. I hear Shell tried the same thing in the United States. They got into a bit of trouble because there was actually one noble soul that tried to buy 94 octane, but there was none to be had. And there was a lawsuit and so on and so forth. But again, the story is very simple, that by offering 94, Petro-Canada got the sales of 91 to go up. Right? And if you think about sort of the power in a phenomena like this, right? There's a simple prescriptive advice, which is that if there is anything you want to sell, an idea, a product, a concept, straddle it with two options, one of which is cheaper and worse, and the other one which is more expensive and better, and that increases the likelihood that people will pick the one in the middle. Now, this doesn't always work. A lot of behavioral economics isn't an exact science. It is what we call a stochastic science. It says the probability of people picking something changes. But this really works, and it works because, as I said, people don't really know what their preferences are. They infer their preferences from the environment. Right? Here's a slightly different example. And this one comes from research done by two professors at Columbia, Eric Johnson and Dan Goldstein. Eric and Dan were trying to understand what the implicit organ donation rates are across different countries. They surveyed about 65 different countries. They collected data on their organ donation systems, how much was invested, how the systems actually worked, that sort of stuff. And this graph kind of summarizes their key aha insight from the research, which is they found that there were a bunch of countries on the left with the golden bars where the implicit or the effective consent for organ donation was pretty low. So you had Denmark with 4.25, you had the Netherlands with 27, that's high, but still on the lower side. England with 17.17, Germany with 12, we've got the United States with like 3, we've got Canada with less than 3. And then you've got a whole bunch others, the ones with the blue bars that are close to 100%. So you've got Austria with 99.98 and Belgium with 98 and France with 99.9. And this is what's going on. Like, why do we see a bunch of countries so close to 100% and a bunch others so close to 0? There's nothing in the middle, right? I mean, you would expect somebody would have a 50% consent rate. Nobody had a 50% consent rate, right? And they tried to run these complex regression models with how much you spend and how your system is designed. Nothing seemed to explain these differences, right? Except one thing, right? So think about the province of Ontario, if you want to donate your organs, right, and the system has changed a little bit over the past 6 months, but it used to be that you had to go to the Department of Motor Vehicles when you got your license renewed. You needed to ask the agent for a form saying that you wanted to donate organs. Half the time, the agent had no clue what you were saying. If they did have a clue, they would fish out a form. You filled it, you handed it back. Then the form somehow made its way to the registry. The registry would send you a letter. You would then go online. You would sort of, enter your details, and you would then get a card which you needed to sign. And once you did all of that, you were a registered organ donor. Right? It turns out the process in Hungary, for example, is very similar but slightly different. Right? In Hungary, it is assumed that you're going to donate your organs. Right? If you do not want to donate your organs, you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, you ask for a form. If the guy knows what he's doing, you fill up the form, you mail it in, same story. Right? Now, again, if you think about what's happening here, right? Think about a problem like organ donation or saving for money or whether I should recycle something or put it into the garbage can. These are not things that people are born with a preference for. Right? People infer their preferences based on what's going on around them, and by setting a different default, you create a different norm, right? So if the default is that I'm going to assume that everybody's going to donate their organs, well, that sounds like a good thing to do, right? On the other hand, if the default is that nobody's going to donate organs, well, maybe I shouldn't donate organs too, right? So again, what's happening across these two examples is that people are using information from the environment to sort of form or construct their own preferences. And that's the kind of stuff that behavioral economists are excited by, right? They're excited by the fact that you can actually take a choice environment, you can change things very, very slightly without actually changing the content of the information. You can present something as a different default, you can present something as 3 separate choices versus a choice with 3 options, and you can get big jumps in people's preferences. There is nothing in the theory of economics that can explain any of this behavior. Right? The only thing that can explain this behavior is that people are stupid, right? But people are not stupid, right? And there's a big theory emerging that sort of starts explaining some of these behavioral principles. So this is sort of a default and status quo bias. The whole notion of opting in versus opting out. I moved to Canada from Hong Kong many, many years ago. And when I did, I just started getting more junk mail than I could ever remember in Hong Kong. Right? And I started looking closely at my credit card applications, and there was a difference right there to see. In Canada, my credit card application said, if you do not want to receive junk mail, in very fine print at the bottom, sign here, date it, and sort of get it notarized or something really complicated like that. In Hong Kong, my credit card application said, if you do want to receive junk mail, well, it didn't say junk mail, it said offers, sign here and date it and that sort of stuff. So same story, small changes in question framing have big effects on how people behave, right? Let's talk a little bit about how people think about money. It's an interesting sort of area of research because the economic assumption is that a dollar is a dollar. I mean, no matter where you get it from, no matter how you earn it, no matter who gives it to you, a buck is a buck. It turns out a buck is not a buck. Right? It turns out that people spend money differently as a function of how they earn it. So money that you earn through hard labor is valued more than money that you get as a gift. Well, that sounds strange, right? But that's the way it is, right? In the United States, or in fact in Canada as well, the government takes our, deducts salary at source, and then at the end of the year, if we've been good, they will send us a refund check. Now that's our money that we get back from the government, right? But people spend their income tax refunds on things that they would never spend their salary on. Right? There's a professor at Harvard who did some research. He just asked people, what do you spend your income tax refund on? Right? And vacations, massages, buying new cars, whatever else, down payment on a new car. Would you spend salary on that? No, never do that. Right? Here's another example, right? So think about a simple thought experiment, right? So let's imagine that you had tickets for planned to go to the symphony this evening. The ticket is going to be $100. Let's imagine you went to the symphony hall, you bought your ticket, you went out to dinner, and then somewhere along the way you lost the ticket. Right? The box office tells you they can't replace the ticket, so if you really want to go and watch the show, you have to buy another ticket. Right? And the question is, would you do it? Right? And the answer to that question well, sort of depends on what they're performing and who you're with and how important is this music to you and that sort of stuff, right? That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is to compare that story with a second story, which is the same symphony hall, the same performance, the same company. But instead of losing the ticket, you reach the symphony hall and you realize that you've lost $100 in cash. Right? Would you buy a ticket? Right? Now, let me show you the data in terms of what people say. Right? If you lose cash, most people will sort of look at you and say, what sort of a question is that? I mean, obviously I'll buy a ticket. Right? But if you've lost a ticket, only 17% of the respondents will say, yes, I'll buy a second ticket. Right? Now, as a behavioral researcher, this seems perfectly plausible. It's normal. It seems like reasonable behavior. I can construct a few stories as to why this is the case. If you're an economist, this is outright stupidity. Right? Because if you really think about this problem, what's happened is in both cases, the person in question has lost a piece of paper. In both cases, it's because of their own carelessness. The only difference is that in one case, you lost it before you bought the ticket. In the other case, you lost it after you bought the ticket. Right? Why is there such a big difference? Well, the story that behavioral economists tell is something called mental accounting. Right? And it's a story which basically says that human beings, I mean, this is a scary story, but it's true, is human beings behave like accountants. I mean, we do. Right? So, for example, when we decide to go to the symphony, we set up this sort of mental account with the budget of $100. And the moment you buy the ticket, well, you know what? That budget is blown. Right? So now if you lose the ticket, well, too bad, buddy, because there's nothing left in that account. Right? But if you lose cash, well, that's okay, because that comes from the general expenses account. Right? Now, the basic phenomena of people treating money differently as a function of how they label it has profound effects and profound implications for how we can get people to save money or to spend money. Right? And I'll talk about that in a minute. Right? But if you just think about your neighbor Joe, who has set aside some cash in a separate savings account, which he has earmarked as his children's education account. Right? What's the likelihood that he's going to spend that money on buying a new car? Right? It's low. Right? And what's happened in that case is he's basically simply by labeling money with a particular purpose, with a particular designation, you are able to change people's willingness to spend that money. And that's really powerful and profound, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to harness that, right? One more quick principle, and then I'll move on. I'll talk about some examples. Loss aversion, the idea here is that losses hurt you more than gains make you happy. Right? It's a slightly abstract concept to gauge because you're comparing two emotions, the amount of happiness versus the amount of sadness. But it's a very simple idea. There was a simple story that illustrates this. Number of years back, 1996 or 7, I forget. I think it was. I lived in Hong Kong. I had this carpet salesman that came to my house. They have the door-to-door carpet salesman. I don't know if you've ever experienced that phenomena. But this guy showed up at my house at 8 a.m. On a Saturday morning. I was barely awake. He rang the doorbell and he said, your colleague so and so recommended that I come to your house. And why did my colleague do that? Right? And he said, would you like to see some carpets? Right? And I said, I figured that the quickest way of getting rid of him was to say yes. He looked like the persistent type. Right? So I said, sure, just show me 2, and that's all I'm going to see. Right? By way of background, at that point in time, I was poor, and I needed to save all the money that I could. I'm still poor, and I need to save all the money that I could. But he showed me 2 carpets, one of which was amazingly beautiful. It was a hand-woven Indonesian silk rug. I still remember it. It's etched in my memory. There were too many zeros in the price tag. Right? And so I basically said, this is a wonderful rug, but I don't want it. right? And my look of delight obviously showed on my face because he looked at me and said, "Sir, here's what I can do for you." Right? Now, the moment a salesman says that to you, you know that's sort of the kiss of death. So he said, "Why don't I leave the rug with you for 2 weeks?" And I said, "You know what? You got to keep in mind, this was a Hong Kong Chinese salesman trying to sell a carpet to an Indian marketing professor. So you've got an interesting cultural context right there." And I said, "No, let's not do that because I know what's going to happen, right? I know you're going to come back in 2 weeks and you're going to either say that there was an implicit understanding that I would buy it, or you're going to point out to some corner and say that it's damaged, so I should keep it." And he said, "No, sir, you know what, you can write up whatever you want, I'll sign it for you, and we can agree on that." So I went up to my home office, I typed up this like legally sounding document with whereas and thereabout and whatever else, right? And he signed it, and I signed it, and he kept a copy, and I kept a copy. And he left the rug, and he came back in 2 weeks, right? He came back, he knocked on my door again at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he basically asked me if I wanted to keep the rug, and I said no, right? And I was expecting some pushback, but all he said was okay, right? So I'm standing there thinking, you know what, this salesman needs some training. I mean, all he says is okay, right? And he said okay, he went into my living room, rolled up the rug, put it on his shoulder, and left, right? And I said, I'm thinking this is easy. I was expecting a lot of resistance, and I followed him to to the door to make sure he was leaving, which he did. And I came back. I shut the door. I came back to my living room, and it looked like a disaster. Right? Now, keep in mind, right? I had that rug in my living room for 2 weeks. I had sort of my wife bought in these, throws and a couple of cushions that kind of seemed to match with the rug. Everything seemed to go well with the rug. That the picture of my living room in my head had the rug in it. But now that it was gone, I missed it. Right? And I almost called him back, but luckily my wife was home, so she didn't let me do that. But again, notice what had happened, right? When he came to my house 2 weeks ago, the carpet was a gain for me. My reference point, I didn't have it, right? So he was offering me a carpet for a given price tag. After 2 weeks, he was taking it away, right? So it was the same exact carpet, but 2 weeks ago it was a gain, and now it's a loss, right? And because losses hurt more than gains make you happy, I was much more likely to want to buy it in the second case, right? And again, there's a very simple prescriptive story there, which is, if you want to sell people stuff, give it to them for free and take it away, right? Cable companies do a great job with that, right? When I moved to Canada, I enjoyed 600 channels for the first 1 month. And then one fine day I woke up and all I could see was CBC News. Right? And I called and paid the $40 or whatever it was per month to get my cable back, right? And I probably wouldn't have done it had they asked me in the first place. Would you be willing to spend $50, right? So again, same principle, right? Once you take something away, it feels like a loss, right? Let me talk about one more sort of simple behavioral principle because I think it has huge implications for getting people to do things that are good for themselves. The yes, damn effect. Right? Think about the following. In fact, let's think about this conference, right? 6 months back, when I was asked to speak at the conference, I said yes. I mean, it sounds interesting. It's 6 months away. I looked at my calendar. There was nothing in it. I said, sure. Where do I sign up? Right? Yesterday, after having taught for 6 hours and having 4 other meetings, like, damn, why did I say yes? Right? Now, this happens to us all the time, right? We have this magical belief that the future is always better than the present, right? But it never is, right? And I don't think human beings learn that very well, right? So this yes, damn effect shows up in everything you do, right? So, for example, exercise machines, right? We buy these machines with the mistaken belief that we're going to have so much time in the future that we'll be down in our basements pumping away. But most exercise machines are not used after 2 months after purchase, right? My colleague John Gorville and I did a study a number of years back in a YMCA in the Denver, Colorado area, we actually tracked people in terms of how much they exercise as a function of how they pay for their YMCA membership, right? We had a bunch of people that paid once a year, right? And so let's say you pay $300 of your annual membership fee on January the 1st. Everybody's on the machines for the first 2 weeks of January. They're all there, right? They've tried every single machine, the elliptical, the bikes, everything, right? By February or March, other things start becoming more important, right? The pain of payment has kind of sort of faded into the background. By July, nobody's there anymore. By October, what, YMCA? And in November, the consumption spikes up just a little bit because that's when you get your renewal notice. Right? And he said, geez, I paid $300 for this stuff, right? I'm going to go consume it. Okay? On the other hand, if people pay monthly, then they are much more regular with their exercising behavior. Right? Now, this is again very profound because it tells me that I can actually change the way people consume things simply by making the pricing of that thing more salient to them, right? Case in point, we did a study a number of years back in the Boston, Cambridge area in the United States, where we looked at health plans. People paid a lump sum every year for a health plan that included an annual checkup and a vaccination and a couple of doctor's visits and so on and so forth. And it turns out that most people didn't go and get their annual checkup. In fact, in the US at that point in time, only about 12% of people actually went for their annual checkups. And we know that preventive health care is good because the system saves a lot as compared to letting people get sick. So we said, what can we do to get people to actually go for the annual checkup? And what we did was we took the membership from this health plan. We randomly divided them into two groups. In one case, we basically told them that you're paying X dollars for this annual plan, out of which a certain amount goes towards your annual checkup, right? And in the other condition, we just said you're paying X dollars for the annual plan, right? And we found that the ones that were told that that they were entitled to a health checkup because they'd already paid $50 for it, were 6 times as likely to go and get their annual checkup than people who were not told that. Right? We did a bunch of other interesting things. One of the things we did was we called up a number of people and we randomly gave them an appointment, right? We just called them and said, you know what, you have an appointment on January the 16th at 4 p.m. Please call us if you want to change it, right? And simply by giving people appointments, we were able to increase the consumption of annual checkups by 5 times, right? Because what you're doing is you're now no longer putting the ball in people's courts, right? It's the default story all over again, right? Is if I'm going to tell you, you have to call me to set up an appointment. Well, there's too many things to do. I've got, meetings today and I have to take my kids to work. I don't have the time. But if you give me an appointment and then you say, well, look, call me if you want to change it, right? Now, all of a sudden, I find room in my calendar for it, right? So that's the yes, damn effect, and it can be used in very powerful ways. The simplest thing you can do is every time you want to get people to do something that's good for themselves, make sure you tell them to do it not today, but in the future. Right? Get them to pre-commit to doing stuff, and they'll do it for you, right? Now, I'm just going to share with you one simple example. This is completely unrelated to financial well-being, but I want to share it because I think it's interesting. This is an example from Google Labs. It's about a behavior that a lot of us engage in, which is we send email that we later regret. Right? I mean, all of us do this, right? And we end up regretting the email only after you hit the enter button on your keyboard. I mean, you can stare at that email for as long as you want. It seems perfectly fine, right? But it's only when you hit the enter button that the damn part kicks in, right? And this problem can become worse if, in fact, you are in the habit of going out for a drink on Friday evening, and you come back home and you decide you want to email your boss and tell them what you really think about them. Or about their idea. But what Google lets you do is it lets you impose a self-control device on yourself, right? So for example, you can tell Google, look, I plan to be drunk on Friday evening, right? Or Thursday morning, or whenever it is, right? And it's not just drinking. You can say, I'm going to be stressed. I have, my kid is in hospital. I'm going to be stressed. So impose a check on my email. And what Google will do is during the period when you tell it to be vigilant, it'll make you solve 5 math problems. Right? So you write up your email, you hit enter, and then it says, what is 69 minus 38, and what is 11 times 2? And if you get all 5 of them correct, it'll send your email. Right? The thing, here's what's interesting about it, right? You can set this up, and once you set it, it is set in stone. You can't undo it. Right? And it lets you do that every month. It lets you specify, when to check your email. But that's the kind of thing, that is sort of, you think about it as a self-control device that you can impose on yourself. Okay? Now, let's skip this one. Let me talk about nudging, and I'll talk about a couple of specific examples, right? So this is the book I talked about, Taylor and Sunstein. The point they make in the book is interesting, which is they say, well, look, you know what? Rather than investing effort into, well, I guess rather than isn't the right word, but in addition to investing effort into persuading people or making the product better or whatever it is, could you change the context in which the decision is made and increase the likelihood that people will do what is good for them, right? So for example, if I want people to consume more healthcare, or preventive medication, can I sort of set up the context such that they have an automatic appointment, and then they need to call in to change that, and that's a nudge because you haven't actually changed how much they pay, you haven't changed what the product is, the only thing you've changed is the decision that they're going to make, rather than sort of an opt-in decision, now they're making an opt-out decision, right? So that's the point they were making, and I just want to make sort of two key ideas in terms of applying a lot of what is said in that book to financial well-being and financial literacy, right? There's been a lot of debate about nudge versus educate, right? So people in the community talk about, well, you know what, nudging is degrading because you're actually manipulating people. Educating them is empowering because you give them the tools. I don't know that that's a one or the other debate. I think the debate should be how can we best harness both, and I'll talk about why I think you need to do both. And I do also want to make the point that nudging is just one way of harnessing human psychology. There are many other ways. You could think about products that are behaviorally informed or programs that are behaviorally informed, and I'll give a couple of examples of that as we go through, right? So, if you think about behavior change, right, especially in the financial context, I mean, there are 3 things that I think need to happen. One is people sort of need to recognize that there is a problem. People need to recognize, gee, I should be saving more, or gee, I don't have any funds for my children's education. Once they've recognized that, they need to actually go out and act, and that action could involve opening an account or starting an RESP or whatever that might be. And then they need to maintain and nurture that action. Right? So it's not just important to open the account, but you've got to make sure that you contribute to it and keep nurturing it. And I would make the argument that I think education is huge for step 1 and step 3. Right? So education is important to get people to realize that they need to do stuff. Right? It is important to get them to figure out what they need to do. So what should I invest in, stocks or bond? What's my portfolio going to look like? But it's really getting people started that's the challenge. Right? Most people who don't save enough know that they don't save enough. Right? It's not a problem of knowledge. Most people know that they should be saving more. It's just real life gets in the way of just going and opening a bank account, for example. Right? So that's the spirit in which sort of I think about nudging versus education. Simple example, right? This was research done in the US on the very simple idea of how do we get people to open bank accounts, right? And this was done with unbanked low-income consumers in the US. This was research done at a soup kitchen in Trenton, New Jersey, right? They attended a financial literacy workshop. These were people that had no bank accounts. Whatever little savings they had, they would put into plastic bags and stuff them under the mattress. And a lot of people would tell you that the reason I don't open a bank account, well, there's 2 things. One is I have these 6 jobs I'm trying to juggle and 3 kids I'm going to raise, right? I don't have the time to go and open a bank account. Okay, that's one, right? And then other people would tell you, well, look, I feel uncomfortable going and doing this, right? There's all these people in suits in the bank, and I don't feel like I belong there, right? So in the workshop, the researchers actually talked about the benefits of opening a bank account, and everybody nodded and said, sure, they would do it. Only about 11% went and opened a bank account. right? In a second set of conditions, so in a second workshop, what the researchers did was they said, well, the same exact workshop, the same benefits, people nodded, then they were given a form, right? And in the form, basically, they had to put down their name, their social security number, and sign a statement saying, yes, I do intend to open a bank account. And they signed it, the forms were collected, and 63% of people opened a bank account from that workshop. Right? Now, notice what's happened here, right? The only difference between the two workshops was somebody implicitly agreeing to open a bank account through signing a piece of paper. It somehow made that commitment more real. The piece of paper said, I know you're busy today, but sometime in the next month, would you open a bank account? People said yes. Suddenly, 6 times as many people went and opened a bank account, right? So that's a simple nudge. It hasn't changed the offer. It hasn't changed the content of the program. But it's got more people to open bank accounts. Here's another product, right? And again, it's described beautifully in the Nudge book. It's called it's a program called Save More Tomorrow. It relies on this idea that people are willing to commit to saving in the future, but today they have financial needs, right? And so this was run in a number of companies. Employees promised to save more tomorrow, right? Essentially, the plan manager came to you and said, well, look, I know you've got financial commitments today, but would you save more tomorrow? Do you think it's a good idea to save more in the future? And everybody said yes, right? And then they signed a piece of paper which says, every time I get a salary increase, X%, and they could determine what that X was, is going to get swept to a separate bank account, which I'll never see. Now, they didn't actually say that, but that's what happened. Right? So separate bank account, and the savings were linked to the salary increases. So every time there was a pay hike, people saved more. People were automatically enrolled into the program, so they had to opt out if they didn't want to do it. Right? And that was beautiful because a lot of people, this was a norm story. Everybody else is in the program, must be a good program. I'm going to be in it too. Right? So a lot of people didn't bother to opt out. And this was beautiful from a number of different behavioral dimensions. Dimension number 1, we talked about loss aversion, right? Saving more today is a loss because I now have to give up something that I'm used to, right? But in the future, because I never actually see that X%, I never get used to that consumption. Right? So that was one. It takes care of loss aversion, right? It uses the idea of pre-commitment. It uses the idea that people believe that the future is easier to accomplish things in than the present. And it's a beautiful mental accounting story because the moment you move the cash into a separate account and it's earmarked as a savings account, people are less willing to withdraw money from it. It turns out that the researchers in this case found that this product actually outdid the advice from the best wealth manager by significant amounts. I mean, again, what's happening here is it's not a literacy program per se. It's a nudge program. You've essentially created a product that people can end up opting into. And it increases savings rate. Couple more quick examples, and then I'll perhaps shut up and take questions. Right? This one is based on my work in India. This is sort of another simple behavioral nudge principle. It's the principle that says that if you've got a task that is due this week as opposed to next week, you are more likely to work on it. Right? Now, think about the following. Right? So let's say you've got a report that's due 5 days from now. Right? But today is Thursday and the 5 days are, next week on Wednesday, versus today is Monday and the 5 weeks are Friday evening. Right? When are you more likely to start working on the report? You're more likely to start working, in the condition when the report is due this week, because that's how people tend to plan their life, week by week or month by month or year by year. And so we actually use that principle in a field experiment in India. We had this was work done with a colleague of mine, Min Zhao, and what we did was we offered these farmers a savings product that had a 20% match. Right? So the government actually matched 20% of your contribution in this product if you did 2 things, right? If you opened an account in this designated institute and you had 5,000 Indian rupees in that account within 6 months, right? So if you did both those things, then the government would match 20%. So this was like free money that people were getting, right? But the difference was some people got this offer in June, right, of last year. And then they were told that the deadline for doing, for these two things was December the 16th, I forget what the exact date was, of 2010, versus others got the offer in July, and for them the deadline was January the 16th, 2011. Right? So it was either this year or the next year, right? And we found significant differences in the number of people that chose to open these accounts, right? So for example, in the left bar, after this information was imparted in a financial literacy seminar, 30% said, sign me up now, if the deadline was this year, right? Only 8% said that they would open an account if in fact the deadline was next year, because anyways, it's in the future, right? I'll think about it at some other point in time, right? So again, a simple nudge that got people to act in terms of opening a bank account, right? My last example has to do with again, rural India, helping people save more money. Again, education helps to convince people about the need to save. Most people comprehend the need to save, yet they don't actually save more. So how could we actually convert intent into action? And I thought about this problem, and this was done in the Indian context. Rural India, unbanked consumers, cash economy, unpredictable earnings. So the harshest possible conditions under which you could design savings products. I thought about solving this problem by solving a slightly different problem, right? And the different problem was a popcorn problem, right? I've got a picture on the left of what you would get if, in fact, you went to the concession stand during the movies and asked for a large popcorn, right? You get this big bucket. It's kind of like that big, right? It's got about 16 cups of popcorn. You don't even want to know how much butter is there in it. And what is shocking about these buckets is that most people actually finish the entire thing during a movie, right? But think of a simple thought experiment, right? Suppose I took the same quantity of popcorn and I divided it up across 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 bags, and I gave you those 6 bags. Would you eat as much? Right? And the answer is no. Right? As a behavioral economist, well, that's interesting, but why does that happen? Right? It happens, and I've got a theory that explains that. It's called a theory of decision points. It happens because people don't, they make a meta decision to consume. We never say, look, I'm going to consume 16 grams of popcorn. We just say, I'm going to eat popcorn. Right? And then the context determines how much you eat. Right? So if I've got a bucket sitting in front of me, I just keep picking them up one by one. I'm not going to say, should I eat this one or not? What about the next one? We don't do that. Right? We don't do that until we come to a point where we have an active decision to make. Right? With the bags, you finish a sixth of the popcorn, then you have to decide, should I open the next bag, yes or no? Right? And the more of those active decisions you insert in people's consumption behavior, the more likely you are to get prudent consumers to stop and say, well, gee, I've eaten a lot. It works with popcorn. Does it work with cash? Right? So we actually did a bunch of experiments. I'm going to just share with you sort of some very, very basic findings. We did some experiments where we took cash salaries, we divided that equally into 4 or 5 envelopes, and we found, in fact, that just the act of dividing cash across several envelopes makes it more likely that people will save more, right? We also use the idea of labeling money. So the point I made earlier about giving money a name changes people's behavior. So we use that principle with some laborers in India. We actually gave them about 10% of their cash salary in a separate envelope. It was marked savings, right? And we said, this is what you should aim to save, right? So it was segregated, it was earmarked. And we earmarked it in different ways, right? So half the people in this particular experiment got an envelope which said that's the Indian word for savings. There was cash in it. A number of people saved it. In fact, savings rates went up from about 3%, which was the baseline, to about 9% if they just had cash segregated in an envelope. And then for a bunch of others, we did something slightly more devious, which is we told them that they want to save for their children's education. And then we put a picture of their children on the envelope, right? And suddenly savings rates doubled. Okay, we've done even more devious things with these envelopes. So right now, we are actually doing a study where instead of using paper envelopes, we use plastic envelopes. right? And the trouble with plastic envelopes is you can't tear them open easily. Like paper, you can just kind of do that if you wanted to. There go my notes. But with plastic, you need a perforation, right? And what we did was, in one condition, we actually had a perforation running through the left side of the envelope. In the other condition, we had it running through the right side of the envelope, which meant that if you had to get the cash, you had to tear the picture of your kids, right? Nobody did that, right? And again, the idea is very, very simple. Is essentially what we've tried to do in some of these experiments is to inject a dose of emotion. We've tried to inject a dose of choice architecture. We've tried to inject a dose of sort of simple behavioral economics to supplement the literacy programs that we've been running, right? So the message I want to leave you with, I think, is a fairly simple message. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things we could talk about, but I'm going to skip that, right? Is I think, literacy is great. I think it's essential, it's necessary, but I think we have to help people act on the knowledge that they have, right? And that's where I think behavioral economics plays a big role. There are still some challenges. I think it's a very new science. So unlike economics, we don't have as many models or prescriptive devices in our field. The rules of thumb that we have are still very general, right? They're very context specific as well. So what might work in the Indian context might not work in the Chinese context. So you've got to actually experiment a lot. And the field as a whole focuses more on the direction of effects and not on the sizes of effects. So it's difficult for me to predict by how much savings rates would go up. But I can predict that they would go up, right? There are also issues of scaling. So there are lots of examples like the ones I've talked about in India, in the United States, some in Canada, of local success, right? But there are bigger challenges in terms of scaling them up. So this works beautifully in 6 villages in India. Will it work as a nationwide program in Canada? That's an empirical question, right? And a lot of work in behavioral economics is trying to take what we now think are just purely empirical questions and convert them into theoretical models. But that's the state of the field. Hopefully you've got at least one idea that you can take home to your organizations tomorrow. But I'm always available for questions. And if you have a few minutes now, I'll take some questions now. But feel free to contact me at any point in time. Thank you.